4:47 a.m. An old neighborhood in Minneapolis was locked in complete silence. A thin layer of snow covered the sidewalks, while streetlights cast a muted yellow glow over Victorian homes still asleep. No sirens, no voices, no indication that anything unusual was about to unfold. Then the darkness began to move. From the far end of the street, black SUVs appeared one after another, headlights switched off well in advance, rolling forward slowly in a formation clearly rehearsed many times before. Doors opened without noise. More than 200 federal agents stepped onto the pavement, wearing heavy body armor, ballistic shields raised, night vision optics active. This was not a patrol. It was a deliberate, targeted operation. What made this operation unusual was not its scale, but its location. The target was not a warehouse, not an industrial zone, and not a known criminal stronghold. It was a luxury residence with neatly trimmed landscaping and a driveway cleared of snow the night before. A place neighbors had long believed to be completely safe. 4:52 a.m. The order was given. In an instant, the silence was shattered by flashbangs detonating inside the front foyer. Glass broke. The door was forced open. Agents moved in with the speed and coordination of a military assault unit. The entire block woke up, but no one understood what was happening. Inside the house, there was no panic. Armed individuals were already in position. They occupied hallways, stairwells, and spaces behind marble columns. Their movement was controlled and practiced, indicating they were not untrained civilians. Whatever was being protected inside this residence was valuable enough to justify a dedicated armed security presence. Within minutes, the confrontation was over. The house was secured. The armed individuals were restrained. There was no pause, no sense of relief, because at that moment the agents realized something far more serious. This was the home of a sitting judge. A figure who had presided from the bench, represented the authority of the law, and earned the trust of the community. And if federal authorities deemed it necessary to use these tactics to enter his home before dawn, the issue was no longer a question of guilt or innocence. The question was how deeply the system had been compromised, and why the collapse began on this specific morning. If you want to understand why a pre-dawn federal operation would target someone entrusted with upholding the law, and if you want to follow how investigators traced each signal to expose a network hidden within the system itself, subscribe to Military Power. Because what was uncovered inside that house was only the surface, and the most dangerous part of this operation had not yet begun. The raid on that quiet street did not begin with a search warrant. It began 24 hours earlier in broad daylight, with an incident that appeared chaotic, emotional, and entirely familiar to social media audiences. That afternoon, a routine traffic stop took place on the streets of Minneapolis. The woman behind the wheel loudly objected, insisting she was being treated unfairly. Bystanders raised their phones. Voices escalated. Within minutes, the video spread online, shared as yet another example of tension between civilians and law enforcement. To the public, it was just another viral clip. To federal investigators, it was the entry point. When the vehicle was searched, the narrative changed immediately. Hidden compartments revealed tightly wrapped narcotics, packaged and stacked according to commercial transport standards. Alongside them were vacuum-sealed bundles of cash, showing no signs of personal use. This was not storage. This was cargo in transit. From that moment, the case moved beyond the local level. Financial analysis teams were activated, travel routes were reconstructed, money flows were traced, phone metadata and payment records began forming a broader pattern, and one detail appeared repeatedly, impossible to ignore. The delivery schedule did not align with street-level trafficking. It aligned with the court calendar. Major shipments appeared just before or just after specific hearings. Cases were delayed, evidence was excluded, sentences were reduced. Each legal decision was followed by a corresponding movement of funds timed with precision. That was the moment the investigation escalated. As the inquiry expanded, the figures exceeded any conventional scenario. Hundreds of millions of dollars moved through shell companies, crossed multiple jurisdictions, and followed the rhythm of decisions made inside a courtroom. This was no longer isolated drug trafficking. It was a legal shield, constructed from within the system itself. At the center of that network was a familiar name, a judge with a carefully maintained public image, a figure once regarded as a symbol of fairness within the community, a position powerful enough to slow cases, weaken evidence, and redirect the fate of shipments worth millions. From that point forward, federal command understood the risk clearly. A single leaked signal would trigger data destruction. Physical evidence would be moved. Key individuals would disappear before sunrise. That is why the operation proceeded in silence. That is why surveillance was escalated without delay. And that is why, before daylight, armored vehicles rolled onto that street. But even then, investigators still lacked the most critical answer. They knew who sat at the center. They knew the system had been compromised. What they did not yet know was where the network truly operated. That answer was waiting below ground. The operation did not begin with an explosion. It began with a signal in the wrong place. Several hours before the assault team was deployed, federal surveillance units expanded their monitoring perimeter around the judge's residence. On the surface, everything appeared flawless. No unusual foot traffic, no unfamiliar vehicles, no suspicious movement, a model home in a quiet residential neighborhood. But the data told a different story. Environmental sensors detected abnormal airflow behind the garage. In freezing conditions, the ground should have been cold and stable. Instead, at one specific point, subsurface temperatures were significantly higher than the surrounding area. It was not a water line, not a conventional heating system, and not consistent with residential construction. This was the first warning sign. Analysts cross-referenced the thermal data with archived construction plans for the neighborhood. There were no permitted underground structures, no renovation records, no legitimate explanation for the anomaly. At the same time, a second signal emerged. Financial transfer routes already under observation from the courier case suddenly accelerated. Several intermediary accounts began moving funds outward at an unusual pace, as if preparations were being made for an emergency scenario. The implication was clear. Someone inside the system may have sensed pressure building. At the command center, the picture began to shift. Initially, investigators believed they were dealing with a powerful figure providing protection from a distance. The new indicator suggested something more. If a large structure existed beneath the house, then this location was not merely a decision-making hub. It could be a transfer point, or worse, a primary storage site. That assessment changed everything. A routine search would not be sufficient. A summons would cause the operation to vanish. Time was no longer on the investigators' side. This was the turning point. Federal command was now forced to make a decision with incomplete information. They understood that any delay could allow whatever lay underground to be relocated, destroyed, or trigger a self-protection mechanism. The raid had to take place before dawn. It had to be fast enough to lock down the entire area, and it had to be strong enough to account for the worst-case scenario. Because if a sitting judge required underground infrastructure, independent ventilation, and layers of concealment this sophisticated, then what was being protected was no longer a legal secret. It was infrastructure. And from that moment on, operational units understood they were not entering a house. They were preparing to enter a structure designed never to be discovered. As the clock moved closer to dawn, the plan was locked in. There was no room left for assumptions, no time for debate. Units were assigned with precision, each member knowing exactly where to position, which route to take, and when to stop. The objective was not visibility. The objective was total control. The approach was structured in layers. The outer layer sealed the perimeter, controlling access points and preventing any unexpected vehicles from entering the area. The middle layer prepared for entry, equipped with ballistic shields, breaching tools, and diversionary devices. The inner layer stood ready to manage escalation, prioritizing containment over prolonged confrontation. Every movement was deliberate and measured. Once final confirmation was received, the breaching team moved toward the front entrance. There were no extended warnings, no negotiations, only a short sequence of actions executed exactly as planned. The front door was neutralized. A diversionary device was deployed to disrupt orientation inside confined spaces. Immediately afterward, the formation moved in, maintaining spacing, covering one another, and methodically securing hallways and stairwells. Resistance appeared almost immediately. The armed individuals inside did not retreat in confusion. They held their positions, searched for firing angles, and attempted to slow the advance. Their response indicated preparation rather than panic. At this stage, the advantage did not come from numbers or firepower. It came from discipline and tempo. Federal teams did not spread thin. They did not pursue aggressively into unknown spaces. Each area was secured in layers, room by room, corner by corner. Ballistic shields remained forward. Lines of sight were controlled. Armed subjects were forced out of position, restrained, and removed from the tactical environment. The goal was neutralization, not escalation. Within minutes, the main movement corridors of the house were under control. Floors were locked down. Organized resistance was no longer possible. Those remaining were compelled to surrender once all exit routes were sealed. When the noise subsided, there was no sense of victory, only a heavy silence. Because at that moment, the clearing teams began their work, and small discoveries quickly accumulated. Walls that did not align with structural plans, voids that did not appear in construction records, doors that did not lead to living spaces but to sealed compartments. The house was no longer assessed as a residence, it was assessed as an operational facility. Technical teams marked each anomaly. Every finding was documented, photographed, and secured. No one moved deeper prematurely. At this stage, curiosity was not the priority. Preservation was. If what existed beneath the surface was real, even a minor mistake could cause evidence to disappear, or worse, trigger a chain reaction beyond control. Once the entire structure was secured, the on-site commander issued a brief assessment. The interior operation was complete, but the mission itself was not. What they were looking for was not entirely above ground, and the next phase would force them to move deeper into the space this house had spent years concealing. Once the house was fully under control, the tempo changed. There were no more running footsteps, no more short commands repeated over the radio. Instead, came slow movement, measurement, and verification. Every small detail was treated as a fragment capable of collapsing the entire picture. The first warning sign did not come from a safe or a suitcase of cash. It came from walls that did not align. In a secondary living room, density scanning equipment detected a void behind a decorative wall panel. When the covering was removed, a concealed compartment was revealed. Inside were metal crates stacked with precision, labeled as legitimate commercial shipments. They did not contain household goods. They contained narcotics, packaged to large-scale distribution standards. The quantities quickly exceeded initial estimates. The discoveries did not stop there. The basement revealed additional sealed containers, carefully cataloged, accompanied by handwritten inventory lists and coded markings. This was not temporary concealment. This was a transfer warehouse. Yet the decisive evidence was not the volume. It was the way everything was managed. In a private office, technical teams seized multiple encrypted computers that were still running. These were not personal laptops. They were high-performance systems connected to a separate, closed network. Time became critical. If the system locked or a remote wipe was triggered, all data would be lost. Digital forensics specialists acted immediately, freezing the system state before any security protocols could activate. What appeared on the screens altered the entire investigation. Not just an inventory list tied to the house, not just internal delivery schedules, but a complete operational network, displayed in real time, showing transport routes, transfer nodes, and clearance codes continuously updated. The data did not describe crude criminal activity. It documented direct manipulation of legitimate systems, access codes that bypassed inspections, safe windows during which containers could pass unchecked, valid digital signatures reused consistently over multiple years. That was the moment the case pivoted. The judge was no longer just a distant protector. The house was no longer just a storage site. What was being exposed was a parallel system operating inside the city's official infrastructure. Every data trail converged on a single point. Not street distribution, not suburban warehouses, but the port. The files showed containers labeled as legitimate clearing inspection within minutes, then disappearing from tracking systems. Those involved did not need forged paperwork. They used real access granted by their official positions. At that moment, a system alert appeared. A new shipment was scheduled to clear. The countdown was measured in hours, not days. Command understood they were no longer investigating an individual. They were confronting an embedded structure where legal authority, administrative power, and logistics were tightly bound. If action was not taken immediately, the evidence would leave the port, merge into the distribution network, and vanish as if it had never existed. The raid on the house had completed its purpose, but a new battlefield had just opened. And this time, the target was no longer hidden behind false walls, but in a place far more public, far more crowded, and far more dangerous. The decision was made within minutes. There was no extended briefing, no complex contingency planning. Once the data indicated that a shipment was about to clear, Command understood that every minute of delay carried a cost. The operational focus shifted immediately. Forces on site were split. One element remained behind, to preserve evidence at the residence. The other redeployed without delay, leaving the neighborhood quietly and moving directly toward the port as daylight began to break. Speed became the determining factor. During transit, analysis teams continued feeding real-time updates, vessel schedules, container counts, clearance codes activated during designated safe windows. Every data point converged on the same area, where legitimate and illicit cargo blended together daily. As the vehicle approached, the scene outside was normal. The crane was standing. Workers were starting their morning shift. Containers were stacked as usual. There was no sign of starting, no notification. That very normalcy was the most dangerous thing. Because if those within the network detected irregular activity, they would not resist. They would erase evidence. Federal units did not wait for confirmation from local systems. They moved in, secured key control points, and divided according to the structure already identified in the data. One team advanced toward the administrative offices. One moved directly to the cold storage facility flagged in the system. Another held the waterways, anticipating an attempt to remove cargo by sea. Time pressure intensified by the minute. Warehouses were opened in order of priority. Pallets were dismantled, labels cross-checked, and random inspections conducted. At first, everything appeared legitimate. Frozen food, standard import and export goods, until the outer layers were removed. Behind the lawful cargo were sealed crates, stacked 3 levels high, coded according to the same system previously identified inside the judge's residence. At that point, doubt was no longer possible. While physical evidence was secured, financial teams expanded their work inside the port offices. Paper records, access histories, repeated authorization trails tied to the same small group of individuals over many years. None of them forged documents. They used real titles and real authority to open gates for cargo in minutes, then allow it to disappear from tracking systems. As the operation expanded, an anomaly appeared near the outer edge of the harbor. A watercraft powered up ahead of schedule, moving outside its assigned channel. That movement was sufficient to trigger an immediate response. Interdiction units intercepted the vessel before it could exit inland waters. On deck, Additional contraband was discovered, packaged and positioned for emergency disposal. By this stage, the picture was complete. This was no longer a corrupt judge, no longer a carefully concealed residence. It was a parallel network, operating alongside the official system, from the courtroom to residential streets to the port itself. As the sun rose higher, the port was locked down. Operations were suspended. Individuals linked to the case were removed from their positions. Cargo flow was halted. The operation had moved far beyond its original scope. And as the figures began to be compiled, command reached a stark conclusion. The operation had moved far beyond its original scope. And as the figures began to be compiled, command reached a stark conclusion. From that point on, the story was no longer about action. It was about consequences. When the operation concluded, the numbers began to be pieced together coldly. A total of 5.5 tons of drugs were seized from various locations, not from a single warehouse, but spread across residential areas to seaports. $74 million in cash and assets were frozen, divided, hidden, and rotated according to the rhythm of a long-standing operating system. These numbers aren't just about scale. They speak about time. Because to move such a volume of goods without being detected, this network had to operate steadily for years. Not through open violence, but through processes, signatures, and the trust society placed in legal titles. The social consequences therefore go beyond the arrests. Trust in the courts was called into question. Trust in the control system was shaken. And the belief that power always comes with responsibility was publicly tested for the first time. From the federal perspective, this operation made one thing clear. Strength does not lie in responding after the disaster happens. Strength lies in early detection, interagency coordination, and acting before the system collapses. This is not a story about an individual's downfall. This is a story about how power, if left unchecked, can become the perfect cloak for crime. When titles are used as tools, when processes are exploited rather than broken, the line between legal and illegal becomes dangerously blurred. The lesson is not simple, but it's clear. The greatest threats do not always come from the outside. Sometimes they exist right within the system, operating smoothly, legitimizing every move, until data and timely action force them to be exposed. And that's why this story is not, because what has been revealed is just a branch. Upcoming trials, records to be opened, and names that may yet appear will show how far this network has spread. Because when the dust settles in Minneapolis, the lingering question is not who was wrong. It is this the only case, or just the first time the system managed to stop something worse from happening? And what will be discovered next when the remaining records are opened? If you want to continue following cases where power is abused from within the system, if you are interested in how the federal government traces data, finances, and infrastructure to unravel deeply hidden networks, subscribe to Military Power now. We don't just recount what's happened, we follow closely what will happen next. Because when a network like this is exposed, it rarely stands alone, and the records yet to be opened could change the way you view power, law, and the safety of society.